beginning a segment of these episodes that we'll be dealing with kind of this topic: how can evil and suffering exist with a loving God? Now, I don't ever want to shy away from the reality of evil in people's lives or the reality of suffering. Now, you may have experienced suffering on a greater or lesser scale than I have, but we all experience it, and probably we could say we experience it pretty much every day, whether we see it or it's inflicted in our lives personally. But the result is it generates serious questions about life and about God. And one of those probing questions is that question: how can evil and suffering exist with a loving God? Now, this is a question I believe many people have struggled with, whether you're a believer or an unbeliever. I know as I've ministered on college campuses and with college age young adults, this question, maybe not verbatim, has been asked, but in many different ways, this has been a reason or a question or a reason doubts have arisen, and it's something we have to talk about and look at and really handle. This question or this issue really may be the greatest weapon that the atheist has against God's existence, and the greatest issue that the believer has to reconcile. Years ago, the Barna Group, they do a lot of surveys. They give us a lot of great information, especially considering the younger generation. But they did a national survey and they asked this question: if you could ask God only one question and you knew He would give you the answer, what would that question be? And the top response was, why is there pain and suffering in the world? And I would imagine you have asked that same question or thought through that at some point in your life or many times. And so we want to look at that over the next 4 episodes. Epicurus was an atheist Greek philosopher, and he said this: either God wants to abolish evil and cannot, or He can, but He does not want to, or He cannot and does not want to. If He wants to but cannot, He is impotent. If He can and does not want to, then He is wicked. But if God both can and wants to abolish evil, how comes evil into the world? And that's a great wrestling, if you will, of trying to reconcile God and evil in our world, but we're going to look at that through this. On the other perspective, that was an atheist, a Greek philosopher. Here's a believer, a theologian. John Stott said this: the fact of suffering undoubtedly constitutes the single greatest challenge to the Christian faith, and has been in every generation. Its distribution and degree appear to be entirely random and therefore unfair. Sensitive spirits ask if it can be possibly reconciled with God's justice and God's love. So we know these truths. We know undoubtedly that God exists. We know undoubtedly that God is love, that God is all good. We know that God is all powerful, God is all knowing, and we know that evil and suffering exist. So how do we reconcile these? You see, we can't dismiss the evil and suffering because it's a fact of life. It's there. And we cannot dismiss God and God's love because it's a fact that it's there. So is it possible to reconcile how each of these truths can coexist? I believe that this is a topic that can be answered biblically, it can be answered logically, and very reasonably. No believer needs to shrink away. We don't just need to stick our head down in the sand because it's maybe a tough question, a deep question, one that I believe, depending on how you've been impacted with suffering or evil in your life, can depend on how strong your emotional ties are to this question. But we want to look at it from a very reasonable and logical reason. So where do we begin to answer a great question of how can a loving God exist with evil and suffering? Well, a great way to gain understanding for me is to ask a question and then answer that question, making sure we're weighing all the different sides. So in the next 3 episodes, we will answer these questions. Number 1, where does evil and suffering come from? It had to have a beginning. So when did it originate? Why did it originate? Then second question is this: why does God not stop the evil and suffering? So evil and suffering exist in our world. We understand God's all powerful. Why does He not stop it? And then lastly, what is God doing about the evil and suffering? So He's not stopping it. Then what is He doing? What is His answer to the evil and suffering? So join with us through the next 3 episodes as we dive in and answer these questions.